Okay, well, here we are. Winter is definitely approaching. Even though today it's nearly 60 degrees, the large meteorological teams are out there saying, button up your overcoats, batten down your hatches. Winter will be coming in like a lion. As nature begins to hibernate, of course, that's when we humans begin to celebrate. We have our holidays that just stack up like airplanes trying to land in Chicago, one after the other, and the parties that come with it and the shopping. So nature gets quiet and we get busy. Of course, in the summer, it's exactly the reverse. The bunnies and the insects are all over the yard in the summer, and we're saying, oh, the heat, I have to sit down. Interesting how we balance each other. Days, seasons, existence itself seems to be compounded of apparent opposites, light and dark, cold and warmth, life and death. Is there any wonder, we ask, if there's some unity that holds them all together? And I think that's where faith starts, with a wondering if there isn't a larger basket, a greater container, or as a wonderful prayer once put it, everlasting arms of care that cradle us no matter where we are in life. I pray that something of that hope for something larger, greater, truer be present to you today, be present to us today, and that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my Redeemer. Well, in this month of November, we went from the harvest of the food we saw in October to the harvest of memories, remembrance. Soon our tables will be laden for that secular communion we call Thanksgiving, and we could serve that meal virtually any day of the year, but it's only Thanksgiving because we do it to remember. We put the stuff on the table, and when we smell the smells, there's Grandma in the kitchen. When we carve the turkey, there's Dad or Grandpa trying to get the meat off the bone. When we sit down, we remember that that was where we were when we were such and such an age, or when we moved from the kids' table to the big table. It becomes Thanksgiving because of the memories. This year, our personal memories are a bit overladen with larger anniversaries. For a lot of folks in this room, Thanksgiving 50 years ago was a grim and sad time because just 6 days earlier, John F. Kennedy had been mowed down and assassinated in front of everyone. I was barely a boy, just 10 years old. I was in school when they announced that he'd been shot and later that he had died. When I got home, the black and white televisions, one, we didn't even have more than one was on. My mother was transfixed. We all hovered trying to figure out what was going on. We all knew what had happened, and we all wondered what next or why, and no one knew what it meant. If anything proves that actions speak louder than words, that moment was it. The actions spoke with an immense volume. It drowned out everything else, Thanksgiving well into Christmas. And because it was on television, what we remember are not words, but images. We know what Walter Cronkite said, but what's in your head when you think of that is a limousine and people in it, and film that was recorded later and that we saw over and over again. When we think of that day, we see things. We don't hear things. I think most terrible events render us speechless, though, don't you think? My wife, Wendy, and I were staying home one winter day in January of 1986. We had a little boy, and they were firing off the space shuttle, so we all sat down to watch it. And then something happened as it went up, and nobody knew what it was, but we knew it wasn't good. And that's the image we all have. That's what, when we think of the Challenger disaster, it's that picture of the explosion that comes to mind. And then 15 years later, I'm in my apartment along the East River in New York, and I hear a terrible sound that sounds like a construction accident. But then I hear people shouting, and I look out my window and see the Twin Towers aflame. And that's the image we have of that. That's what we know of it. It's the picture which they showed us over and over and over again till it was numbing and nauseating at the same time. Actions do speak louder than words, but they have no meaning. All we have is the image. In each of those cases, it was only the words that came later that gave meaning to what had happened before. Very similar to an earlier moment in time, at this season, in fact, pumpkin time, some would call it, a good time for moving corpses and a good time for listening to speeches, because brisk air keeps the stench away and it carries voices without amplification. At noon, a procession began through the little town. It went less than a mile on that day. The president, astride his horse, wore a mourning band on his hat and white gloves that he held the reins with. And the orator of the day was not the president, but the great scholar, statesman, orator, and Unitarian minister Edward Everett. By all accounts, the occasion that day was a success. The main address that went on for 2 hours was hailed as the best account of the battle and the war that anyone had ever heard and likely would ever. Yeah, he spoke for 2 hours, Edward Everett did, all of it from memory, describing the war and the battle and pointing to the places around them to point out where they were and what had happened. Then it all happened back in the first days of July, but that day was November 19th, 1863, 150 years ago this week. Somewhat after the long speech and prayer and a little bit of music, they invited the president to do the ribbon cutting, essentially, to say a few dedicatory remarks. There were very few, 272 words to be exact. And though he said the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, those words have had as much impact on us, perhaps more, as the battle and the war itself. It might be safe to say that had Lincoln not said those words, were he not himself assassinated a year and a half later, he probably would not be the most studied human being after Jesus Christ. I say that because I did some research. 15,000 books have been written about Abraham Lincoln. Now, there have been some books written about Kennedy and the assassination, about 2,000. Dying an ignominious death will at least give some people a reason to write a book. And you can go and find the books. They're all over the place. And there are even books about the Gettysburg Address itself, notably one by the great scholar Garry Wills, and I commend it to you. But I won't report on it here. I leave it to you to explore the culture and the history and the analysis and the language. And it is so much worth your time. You should do it. But what I want to share with you in the few minutes I have left, as I compare these two momentous occasions that are separated by a century and 3 days, what I want you to ponder is that while actions may speak louder than words, words endure longer than actions. Actions may shape the present, words shape the future. We remember Lincoln at Gettysburg because those words continue to speak to us, even though they were directed to those people and those people alone. Now, Edward Everett, in 2 hours, conveyed more facts, said more about what was going on in the war, but Lincoln said what it meant. And that's why we remember Lincoln and not Everett. The writer Antoine de Saint-Exupéry said, "We live not by things, but by the meaning of things." And the Gettysburg Address told us what the war meant. It told us what America meant. Of course, we can't know what he actually intended. We're not mind readers, but the outcome is indisputable. Gary Wills said, Lincoln performed, quote, "one of the most daring acts of open-air sleight of hand ever witnessed." The people walked off from the curving graves on the hillside into a different America. Lincoln had revolutionized the revolution, giving people a new past to live with that would change their future indefinitely.